Five Nights at Freddy's needs no introduction at this point. However, if it ever were to have one, I think the recently released film would fill that role both perfectly and, surprisingly for this franchise, seamlessly. I honestly don't think this film could have treaded the line of good introductory piece while also being a treat for fans new and hardcore alike any better. Let's talk about it. Before I truly begin, however, just know that this video will be structured like this. No spoilers, or at the very least light, surface level spoilers, and then a full spoiler section, which may or may not be unscripted. Only time will tell. Update, time is told, it's very scripted. And is as much a video essay as it is a standard review. It's a 2-for-1 deal, if you will, so I hope you enjoy it. Now, without further ado, let's get into this. During the film, I looked over at my girlfriend and just exclaimed how surreal this experience was. I mean, this is the FNAF movie, people. So many years in the making. They had to nail a few key aspects here, and they absolutely did. Whatever reviewer is going to primarily talk about is the visual design. The set is magnificent, and that Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria sign lives rent-free in my head. It really feels like the real pizzeria, with it being just as much of a character as the animatronics themselves. And speaking of those animatronics, Jim Henson's Creature Shop had an absolute home run out of the park with this one. Seriously, I'm just blown away. Seeing the animatronics I know and love be realized with such precision and care, and then to see them move is, as I said before, just so surreal. I could go on and about it, but you've probably heard the same spiel from every other reviewer, so I'll move on. The acting was actually pretty phenomenal, especially Josh Hutcherson. We understand the characters well as they are fleshed out by the actors, but also by the story itself, something that is also, surprisingly, quite good actually. We'll be talking more about the story in the spoiler section. All in all, if you've come to this video looking for a recommendation as to whether or not you should watch the Five Nights at Freddy's movie, I think you undeniably should. Whether you are a fan of the franchise or not. This is cinema. Now, on to the jump scares. Jump scare good. Put simply, a movie critic's job is to analyze a film in a short span of time, and to make a recommendation based off that analysis. That is, well, the obvious answer here, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. Partially because there are limitations to the amount of time each film is given, which is especially deadly with the FNAF movie. To again state the obvious, Five Nights at Freddy is complex, to put it lightly. Convoluted, some would say. Whichever label you put on it, it's certainly not something a simple film reviewer can properly experience unless they are already a fan. And the likelihood of them being a fan isn't zero, but it isn't exactly high either. Without being at least a bit familiar with this specific franchise, I just don't see how it would be possible to properly analyze it in the way that would dictate how a fan should feel about it. And I just put fan in bold here because I still think under this assumption that they can still judge the movie as an individual piece of art and not as part of a larger franchise. It's not really their jobs to play, I think, like 9 games or read like 27 books. So I can't fault the reviews for not representing the actual fan base, as they only have a limited amount of time and dedication allotted to each individual film they analyze. But the film isn't, in my humble opinion, bad for beginners. I saw it with my girlfriend for a little spoopy date night, and I think it actually hurt her experience familiarizing herself on a surface level with the source material. That the lore of this franchise isn't suited for such a shallow dip in the pool, and that the film wasn't quite ready to answer some of the questions she was bound to have. She wasn't a beginner anymore. She knew the questions to ask, and she wasn't just going to see a random movie. And I believe I told her she knew too much to experience the film in that way, but too little to know the deeper implications and more lore-tied sections to properly appreciate what the film was trying to do for fans, if that makes sense. I knew the community accepted answers to a lot of her questions, and could use my knowledge of the franchise and a bit of intuition to predict the others would be answered with a seemingly inevitable sequel, at least based on its astounding opening weekend. But I'm a pretty hardcore fan of FNAF, or at least a common watcher of Game Theory and GT Live. Do I think this film was great for those in-betweeners who have a limited knowledge of the franchise? Perhaps not. She did still enjoy the film a lot though, and I'd be hard-pressed to say that this film is anything less than a success to impress any level of fandom. But the gripe that critics and even virtually every YouTube reviewer, seriously like every single one, have seems to not be with this, but that it's a bad movie outright. And when they say that, they mean a bad introductory piece for the franchise, that it's only really for fans, that it's a faulty diving board overlooking a deep and vast pool in their eyes. And do I agree with this assumption? Absolutely not. Let's explain why. Now, onto the spoilers. What is FNAF? That's a difficult question to answer. But I think how I would answer it, despite its convoluted lore at points, it's a franchise that truly knows itself. And as any confident thing is, it's never afraid to be itself. This is surely a horror movie, but it's not just that. It's, well, Five Nights at Freddy's. It's a horror movie, sure, but it's also something else. A comedy. FNAF knows what it is, and what it can be is funny. It does take its story seriously, but it never takes itself too seriously. And it never is afraid to make its player base, or its movie audience in this case, laugh. I understand critics here to some degree. Many have said the tonal shifts are jarring, bouncing from lumbering, scary animatronics chasing after people, or perhaps just standing there menacingly, to having Bonnie literally fall over to get into a slumber party fort. Most films don't do this, and most critics haven't played FNAF 5 or 6. Hell, they probably have never even spoken to Hand Unit or been a Freddy Fazbear entrepreneur. They don't understand that Five Nights at Freddy's can be funny on purpose at times. But I also don't think you have to be familiar with that to understand the tone shifts here. Rather, they serve a very interesting and unique purpose, to lure the characters and thus the audience into a false sense of security. I love when comedy is used this way in horror, to get us to let our guard down. Honestly, it's not used nearly enough, and I even incorporated this method into my own horror short film, Squid Boy, that is here on the channel. Go check it out, it's pretty great. One thing I can certainly praise FNAF for is that it has always understood that horror and comedy are the two closest genres there are. Take a scene, action, or concept too far in one direction with horror, it turns into comedy. This is the unintentional outcome, but if you can understand that, you can intentionally use comedy to both let the audience lower their guard, but also juxtapose the funny moments with horrifying sections later on. That's like Meat Canyon's entire channel premise, and that man is a genius. So, a perfect example of this juxtaposition in the FNAF movie is a scene where the cupcake eats one of the vandalizers. It's pretty hilarious, honestly. And then a bit later on, I believe her name is Max, reaches into Freddy's mouth with a genuinely shocking moment of her getting quite literally bit in half. Not the bite of 87 though, sorry, Markiplier. I honestly was not expecting such a gruesome death here, and that's in no small part to the comedy utilized a bit earlier in the film. and made the horror and gruesome violence hit even harder. Another great example is the aforementioned slumber party. The animatronics are only acting fun and goofy because they want Abby to become one of them, which they very narrowly succeed in, partially because of Mike's trauma, yes, but also because he let his guard down, in no small part to their comedic actions. In short, the film utilizes tone shifts to both entertain the audience with humor, or at least entertain me specifically, but also uses it juxtaposed with the horror, adding added weight to the latter in response, as well as getting the characters and the audience, therefore, to let their guards down. Boom. Film defended. But as all reviewers and analysts, I can't take my personal biases out of this equation. Like, juxtaposition may just very well be my favorite word in the dictionary, so perhaps I'm the only one who appreciates it too highly and is looking for intention where they may just be sloppy tone building. Or I'm just a film genius. You decide. I want to read a part of a Rotten Tomatoes certified review for you, written by Carson Timer. Their review will be linked in the description below. I suggest you give it a look for someone else's perspective, since a broad perspective on art is always better than hearing an analysis from one small YouTuber. This confusion continues into the film's tone and outlook on what this story is on a fundamental level. Perhaps due to the amount of development put into this film's concept and script, the narrative often feels like a jumbled mess of ideas. While there is the emotional core within the film centered around Schmidt's trauma, there is the added conflict brought by his aunt, a conflict thrown away without any real weight or substance. There is a connection to Five Nights at Freddy's lore, but this feels forced and isn't established within the actual main narrative of the feature. The film doesn't even seem sure with how it wants to handle its animatronics. While established as villains, the characters face multiple acts of recontextualization, leading to an incoherent presence. Nothing about the film feels succinct or coherent when it comes to building a single strong voice or identity. Quote over. This person, to me at least, surely seems like someone passionate about the franchise, and thus knows their stuff. But I also have to disagree with them here. I quite enjoyed the story itself. Mike's central conflict, which I thought was going to be wanting to move to Nebraska for a better life with his younger sister, turned to him facing his traumatic past. The use of dream theory, sleeping pills, and familiar sights and sounds related to the source of his trauma, his brother's kidnapping, was especially intriguing, and it added weight and necessary layers to his character and his development. Filmmakers like to use little odd quirks to separate their characters from more common associations. Whether that be dream theory, a nice little reference in its own right, or someone just really liking vending machines. I'm looking at you, 3 Days of Happiness. Speaking of filmmaking, when I submitted my first feature film, America Dreaming, to a contest, they said I needed to add tension and more motivating factors to the first act. And for the FNAF movie, the ant serves this job perfectly. Another area where I must disagree with the reviewer's quote. Mike loses his job due to his trauma associated with kidnappers. He has to take care of his younger sister, and after his home receives what looks to be a preamble to an eviction notice, the pressure is officially on. But he still isn't willing to work night shifts as he has to take care of Abby. We as the audience need to be without doubt that taking this job isn't, well, a stupid idea. And the games take care of this by having Michael Afton search for his father and have him atone for his crimes. The film, meanwhile, handles this by introducing the ant. Michael Schmidt can't get a regular job because of his past history, but he has to get a job in order to have any sort of ground in a court case to keep custody of Abby. The ant is the perfect source of pressure in this case, an immovable object that only is after government money, that won't properly take care of Abby, as she views the girl as nothing more than a head case. Once this element is introduced, we as the audience can now understand why Mike is left with no other option but to take the job, and stay employed by Freddy's even when things seem a bit shady. This is the substance itself, a plot device, sure, but so is, technically speaking, any fictional character ever written, meant to get a story or theme across through often conflict with other characters. This plotline isn't exactly ended gracefully, which I think is the bulk of the reviewer's critique here, but I find her demise to be rather cathartic, in a bad guys die in bad ways sort of way. Continuing with this quote, I think the animatronics are handled rather brilliantly. They maintain a menacing presence and clear motivation, that is to make Abby one of them, but they are also, and this is the key here, not the real villains. William Afton is, as he controls them, and anyone familiar with the games will know this to be the case. Well, not the controlling part, but that's just a movie thing, but knowing that obviously that he's like the true villain here. They are innocent and confused children. Thus, I don't believe they're ever meant to be established as true villains. Although if I were to have any gripe with the film, I would say the real villain, good old William A., Mr. I Always Come Back, should be present for more of the film. But of course, that's what the sequel's for with the official rise of Springtrap. They kinda needed to do this. In Scott's own words, once a story becomes so complicated, it's near impossible to tell a compelling narrative directly within that universe. The FNAF movie finds a way around this by doing what the Silver Eyes trilogy did all those long years ago. It uses elements from the source material, but ultimately tells its own story. The film does this to great effect, and what we are left with is a narrative that can be new and entertaining to already established fans, with some surprising twists and turns along the way, like Vanessa being William A's daughter, although people kind of speculate on that anyway, but whatever. But also being welcoming to any newcomers. This is why I think the film is so great for beginners to FNAF. This is similar to how Marvel handles the source material, and well, you've seen how successful that can be for a franchise. Alright, I gotta get this one out of the way. I've seen videos talking about the FNAF movie and how it's a thriller rather than a horror movie, since thrillers focus on story while horror movies focus on scaring people. And honestly, I despise this perception. I've always said that if you go into a horror movie with the primary intent to scare the audience, well, you are not going to craft a film that I will enjoy. Except for maybe Skinamarink. Or should I say... Skinamaree. Films should all be story first, objective second. Otherwise, for me at least, you're just taking away the very heart of the movie. I'm not saying you shouldn't craft scares into it at all, but they should be thematically centered around the narrative and themes. Just think of Hereditary, the greatest horror movie made in the modern times, taking into account, of course, that objective quality does not exist, and there is no greatest anything. It prioritized the story of a family falling apart and centered all the scares around that concept. The FNAF movie does something very similar. That is how you make a horror film, at least in my humble opinion. Hell, FNAF as a franchise is more well remembered for its lore than the actual scary gameplay. The FNAF movie didn't really scare me, although it's rare that any film does. What it did do, though, is entertain me, which is what people who get scared ultimately still get out of the experience anyway. The story was at the heart of the film, a story about overcoming trauma, and that's really all I can ask of it. From both Mike and Vanessa, they learn this lesson, which propels the plot forward. It's just great cinema, plain and simple. But if you were going into it just wanting to be scared, that's also a valid reason to go as well. That's just personally not what I go into horror movies searching for. That being said, though, stop making horror movies just to scare people. We are better than that as filmmakers. All the great horror films, at least ones considered great, have a great story. God, I just need to get that one off my chest. Back to the rest of the video. Actually, I think I've said all I needed to say. If not, maybe I'll make a follow-up. But back to the unscripted part of this video, which is the only unscripted part of this video. Welcome to the end of the video. I really, really enjoyed the movies, you can tell, and I do hope everyone else enjoyed it as well. I don't have too much to say, just I'm going to have my Naruto video, which will be titled Naruto is Never an Underdog Story, coming out soon, so look forward to that. And without further ado, here is a trailer for my current horror short film mentioned in this video, Squid Boy. And as always, thank you for watching.